smell of burnt transmission fluid is something that never really leaves your nostrils, not even after 80 years. It's a thick, heavy scent, like something dying inside a hot oven, mixed with the sharp metallic tang of spent brass. Sometimes I'm just sitting in my recliner in the living room, looking out at the oak tree in the yard, and it comes back to me. It's not a flashback, not like they show in the movies with the blurry edges and the loud noises. It's just a memory that sits down next to me and won't leave. I can still feel the vibration of that Wright R975 radial engine humming through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the steady thrum of a truck engine, it was a growl, a restless, angry sound that told you that if you weren't careful, the machine would outrun your own ability to think. We were in an M18 Hellcat, which was basically a big engine with a 76mm gun strapped to it and just enough sheet metal to keep the rain off. They told us speed was our armor, but when you're 19 years old and looking at the thick, sloped front of a German Panther, speed feels like a very poor substitute for a few inches of solid steel. I remember the way the air felt that morning in the fall of '44. It was crisp, the kind of air that makes your lungs feel sharp, but it was ruined by the exhaust of a dozen idling engines and the smell of wet wool. We'd been sitting in a tree line for what felt like hours, just waiting. That's most of what war is, you know. Just waiting for something terrible to happen, and then wondering why you wanted it to start in the first place once it finally does. My loader, a kid named Miller from West Virginia, was leaning against the turret wall, trying to sleep. I don't know how he did it. The noise of the war was all around us, the distant rumble of artillery that sounded like a giant slamming doors in a house 3 blocks away. But Miller could sleep through anything. He used to say that if a shell was going to find him, he'd rather be dreaming of home when it happened. I envied him that. I couldn't sleep. I just kept checking the breech of the gun over and over, making sure everything was clear, even though I knew it was. My hands were shaking just a little bit, so I tucked them under my armpits to keep them warm and still. We were part of a tank destroyer battalion, and our job was supposed to be simple. Wait for the panzers to break through, then use our speed to get around their sides and hit them where they were soft. But the Germans weren't following the manual that day. They were moving with a kind of arrogance that's hard to describe if you weren't there. They'd spent so long being the biggest bullies on the block that they stopped looking for the little guys. We saw the dust first, a long, low cloud rising above the hedgerows about a mile out. Then came the sound. It wasn't the growl of our radial engines. It was a heavy, rhythmic clatter, the sound of wide tracks grinding the French soil into powder. You could feel it in your teeth. I remember looking through the periscope and seeing the first one. It was a Panther, painted in that jagged late-war camouflage that made it look like a ghost moving through the shadows. And then another one followed it. And another. They were moving in a column, their long guns pointed straight ahead, their hatches open. That was the thing that got me. The commanders were standing waist-high out of the turrets, looking around with binoculars, but they weren't looking at the ground. They kept glancing up at the sky. They were terrified of the Jabos, the P-47 Thunderbolts that would come screaming down from the clouds to drop 500-pound bombs on their heads. To them, the danger was above. They didn't think there was anything on the ground that could touch them in that sector. We were hidden behind a stone wall and a thicket of overgrown brush that hadn't been trimmed since the war started. We were so low to the ground and so quiet, relatively speaking, that they just rolled right past us. The first tank went by, then the second. My heart was hitting my ribs so hard I thought it would break something. I looked down at the gunner, a quiet man named Henderson who'd been a watchmaker before the draft caught him. He had his eye glued to the sight. He didn't move a muscle. He was waiting for my word. I waited until the 6th tank in the line was directly level with our position, exposing its thin side armor. If you hit a Panther in the side, right above the tracks, you've got a good chance of hitting the fuel or the ammo. If you hit them in the front, the shell just slides off like a pebble off a windshield. I leaned down and whispered into the intercom, though I don't know why I whispered. They couldn't hear me over their own tracks. I just said, "On my way, Henderson. Take the trailing one first." We wanted to plug the hole behind them so they couldn't back out easily. Henderson just nodded. He was always calm, that man. I often wonder what happened to those watches he used to fix. I hope his hand stayed that steady for the rest of his life. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The M18 lurched when we fired. It wasn't like a tank, which has the weight to soak up the recoil. The Hellcat felt like it wanted to jump off the ground. The muzzle blast blew a hole in the brush in front of us, and for a second, I couldn't see a thing through the smoke. But then the wind caught it, and I saw the 6th German tank. It didn't explode, not right away. It just stopped. A thin plume of black smoke started leaking out of the engine deck, and then suddenly, a gout of orange flame erupted from the turret ring. It looked like a blowtorch. The commander, the man who had been looking at the sky, didn't even have time to scream. He was just gone. The rest of the column didn't even realize what was happening for the first few seconds. They must have thought it was a mechanical failure or maybe a lone mine. They were so focused on the air that they didn't even traverse their turrets toward the tree line. That was their mistake. Our second shot took the 5th tank in the rear sprocket. It spun around like a wounded animal, its track trailing behind it like a dead snake. Now they were trapped. The road was narrow, flanked by steep ditches and that stone wall. They couldn't turn around, and they couldn't move forward without pushing the burning wrecks. We weren't just soldiers then, we were mechanics of destruction. We worked in a rhythm: fire, reload, adjust, fire, reload, adjust. Miller was a blur of motion, slamming those 76s into the breach until his knuckles were bleeding. The heat inside the Hellcat was becoming unbearable. The smell of the cordite was so thick you could taste it on your tongue, like licking a dry battery. By the time the 3rd tank went up, the Germans finally realized the threat was coming from the ground. They started frantically turning their turrets, but the Panther's turret traverse was slow, powered by the engine. Since they were stationary or dying, they couldn't bring their guns to bear fast enough. We were like a swarm of hornets. I signaled the driver, a boy named Sully, to move. We didn't stay in one spot. We'd fire, then Sully would gun that radial engine, and we'd pop up 20 yards down the wall and fire again. To the Germans, it must have felt like they were being hit by a whole company of tanks. But it was just us. Just 5 guys in a thin-skinned box, terrified and screaming over the intercom. I remember seeing a German crewman climb out of the 4th tank. His clothes were on fire. He didn't look like an enemy then. He didn't look like a Kraut or a Hun or any of the names we called them. He just looked like a boy about my age who wanted to be anywhere else. He fell off the side of the hull and hit the ground, and he didn't get up. I had to look away. I had to focus on the next target. You can't let the humanity in if you want to survive the minute. If you stop to think about the mothers and the fathers of the men in those tanks, you'll hesitate. And if you hesitate in a Hellcat, you're dead. The 4th tank caught fire after 2 hits. The first one bounced, which sent a spark of pure terror through me, but the second one found the sweet spot. It didn't just burn, it brewed up. That's what we called it when the ammunition inside cooked off. The turret actually lifted off the hull, held up by a pillar of white-hot flame before settling back down at an angle. It was a terrifying sight. The power of it, the sheer violence of all that steel being torn apart. We were on the 5th one now. They were trying to back up, the driver of the lead tank frantically attempting to push the others out of the way. But it was a graveyard of iron by then. The smoke was so thick it was hard to see the targets, but the heat from the fires gave them away. They stood out like black skeletons against the orange glow. We fired our last effective rounds at the final 2. One took a hit to the fuel tanks and went up instantly, a massive fireball that scorched the trees on both sides of the road. The last one, the lead tank, actually managed to get a shot off. I saw the flash of its muzzle and felt the air crack as the shell whistled just inches over our open turret. If it had been 2 inches lower, I wouldn't be here talking to you. It hit a tree behind us, snapping the trunk like a toothpick. Henderson didn't wait for my order. He fired, and the shell went straight through the Panther's side. It didn't burn immediately. It just drifted into the ditch and sat there, the engine dying with a pathetic sputter. 6 of them. 6 of the most feared machines on the battlefield, reduced to scrap metal in less than 5 minutes. We sat there in the silence that followed, our ears ringing, our lungs burning. The only sound was the crackle of the fires and the distant pop, pop, pop of small arms fire somewhere far away. I looked at Miller. He was covered in grease and sweat, his face black from the smoke. He looked at me and didn't say a word. He just sat down on the floor of the turret and started to cry. Not because he was sad, I think, but because the adrenaline had left him, and there was nothing left but the realization of what we'd just done. We had just ended dozens of lives in the time it takes to boil an egg. That's the part they don't tell you in the history books. They tell you about the tactics and the victories, but they don't tell you about the weight of it. I'm 92 years old now, and I still feel that weight. I still see those burning tanks when I close my eyes. I wonder if they ever found that boy in the burning clothes. I wonder if his mother ever knew where he fell. We stayed in that position for a long time, watching the smoke rise. We were low on ammo, and the fear of a counterattack started to set in. You never feel safe after a win like that. You feel like a target. You feel like you've used up all your luck in one go, and the universe is coming to collect the debt. Sully eventually put the Hellcat in reverse, and we backed away into the deeper woods, leaving the burning graveyard behind us. For the rest of the war, I never saw anything like that again. Most of the time, it was just grinding misery, cold feet, and bad food. But those 5 minutes, they've lasted 80 years. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The days that followed that engagement were a strange blur. You'd think we'd be treated like heroes, maybe get a medal, or at least a hot meal, but the army doesn't work that way. We were just told to refit, reload, and get back to the line. We spent the night in a cow pasture that had been chewed up by tank treads and mortar fire. The mud was that deep, cloying French clay that sticks to everything. It gets into your fingernails, your hair, and the gears of your equipment. We spent hours cleaning the Hellcat. You have to take care of the machine, because if the machine fails, the machine dies, and you die with it. I remember scrubbing the spent shell casings out of the turret floor. They were still warm to the touch when we first finished the fight, but by nightfall, they were ice cold and smelled like sour metal. Henderson was unusually quiet. Usually he'd talk about the shop he wanted to open in Ohio, or the way the light hit the hills in the autumn back home. But that night, he just sat by the track, staring at his hands. I asked him if he was all right, and he just looked at me with eyes that seemed 1,000 years old. He said, "Henry, did you see the way the last one didn't burn?" I told him I did. He said, "I keep thinking about the driver. I keep thinking he might still be in there, just sitting at the wheel, waiting for someone to tell him it's over." I didn't have an answer for him. In the war, you learn pretty quickly that there are no good answers to those kinds of thoughts. You just have to push them down into a little box in your mind and hope the lid stays on. If you let them out, they'll eat you alive. We moved into Belgium as the weather started to turn. The rain became a constant companion, a cold gray drizzle that soaked through your coat and settled in your bones. We were supporting the infantry now, which was a different kind of hell. In a tank destroyer, you have a bit of a shell around you. But the infantry, those boys had nothing. I watched them shivering in their foxholes, their feet rotting in their boots, and I felt a deep sense of guilt. We had a heater in the M18, even if it barely worked, and we had a roof of sorts. They had the sky and the dirt. We'd roll past them, and they'd look up at us with these hollowed-out eyes, and you could see the envy and the resentment. They called us the lucky ones. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like a moving target. The Germans hated the Hellcats because we were fast and we were mean. They'd prioritize us. If a German anti-tank gunner saw a group of Shermans and one Hellcat, he'd go for the Hellcat every time. He knew we were the ones who could get behind him before he could traverse his gun. So, we lived in a state of constant high-tension alertness. Every hedge, every stone barn, every dip in the road was a potential grave. You start to develop a sixth sense for it. You learn to listen for the specific whistle of an 88mm shell. It's a sound unlike any other, a sharp tearing noise, like someone ripping a giant sheet of silk. If you hear the whistle, it means the shell missed you. If you don't hear it, you're already gone. I remember one afternoon near a village whose name I can't even remember. Everything in Belgium looked the same after a while, just shattered brick and gray mud. We were ordered to scout a crossroads that was supposed to be clear. We knew better. Clear usually meant that the guys who were there before us were all dead and couldn't report back. We moved up slowly, Sully keeping the engine at a low idle to minimize the noise. I was standing in the turret, my head just above the rim, scanning the tree line with my binoculars. The world was silent, except for the drip of water from the trees. And then I saw it, just a glint. A tiny flash of light from a second-story window in a farmhouse about 500 yards away. It wasn't a sniper, it was too big for that. It was the reflection off the optics of a Pak-40 anti-tank gun. I didn't even think, I just yelled, "Reverse!" into the intercom. Sully slammed it into gear just as the farmhouse wall exploded. The Germans had been waiting for us to pull into the center of the crossroads. The shell slammed into the ground right where we had been sitting a second before, throwing up a geyser of mud and rocks. If Sully hadn't been so fast, That shell would have gone right through our front plate. We didn't wait around. We weren't built for a slugging match. We backed into the cover of a thick stone wall and started to circle around. That was the Hellcat way. You don't fight fair. You move, you hide, you strike from where they don't expect. We spent the next hour playing a deadly game of cat and mouse with that gun crew. We'd pop out, fire a high explosive round at the house, and then disappear before they could reload. Eventually, we brought the whole front of the house down on top of them. I didn't feel any satisfaction. I just felt tired. I looked at the ruins of that house and thought about the family that had lived there. They'd probably spent their whole lives building that place, and in an hour, we'd turned it into a pile of toothpicks and dust because some German officer decided to put a gun in the parlor. That's what stays with you, the waste of it all. Not just the lives, though that's the biggest part, but the waste of everything. The houses, the fields, the animals, the dreams. It all gets ground up in the gears of the machine. I think about that farmhouse sometimes when I'm driving through the countryside here in the States. I see a nice old barn or a sturdy brick home, and I find myself looking for the weak points. I find myself wondering where I'd put an anti-tank gun if I had to. It's a sickness, a way of looking at the world that the war carves into you. You stop seeing beauty and start seeing tactical advantages. Even at 92, I can't help it. My grandson takes me for drives, and I'm sitting there in the passenger seat, silently noting that the ridge over there would be a perfect spot for an ambush, or that the bridge ahead is a bottleneck that could hold up a whole division. He thinks I'm just enjoying the scenery. He has no idea that in my head, I'm still commanding a tank destroyer in the Ardennes. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The winter of '44 was the coldest I've ever been in my life. I grew up in a place where we got snow, but this wasn't just snow. This was a deep, hateful cold that felt like it wanted to kill you personally. It seeped through your layers, through your skin, and settled in your very marrow. We were in the forest, the trees covered in a thick layer of frost that made them look like something out of a fairy tale. But it was a nightmare. The ground was frozen so hard we couldn't dig foxholes. We had to use dynamite just to make a dent in the earth. Most of the time, we just slept inside the Hellcat, huddled together for warmth. The metal of the tank was like an icebox. If you touched it with your bare skin, you'd leave a layer of flesh behind. We'd keep the engine running just long enough to get a little heat into the floorboards, but we had to be careful about the exhaust and the noise. The Germans were everywhere, and they were just as cold and desperate as we were. We weren't fighting for grand ideals anymore. We were fighting for a dry pair of socks and a cup of lukewarm coffee. I remember one night, we were parked in a small clearing. The moon was out, reflecting off the snow so brightly you could almost read by it. It was beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way. I was on watch, standing in the turret with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I heard a sound, a crunch of snow. I grabbed my Thompson submachine gun and leveled it toward the tree line. Out stepped a deer, a big buck, his antlers white with frost. He stood there for a long moment looking at the tank. He didn't seem afraid. He just looked at this hunk of iron and then at me. I could see his breath in the air, little puffs of steam. I didn't shoot, obviously. I just watched him. In that moment, he was the only thing in the whole world that made sense. He didn't care about the war. He didn't care about the borders or the ideologies. He was just trying to survive the night, same as me. He eventually turned and vanished back into the shadows, and I felt a strange sense of loss. I wanted him to stay. I wanted to remember that there was still something in the world that hadn't been touched by the madness. But the madness always came back. A few days later, we were caught in the middle of the breakthrough that they now call the Battle of the Bulge. It started with a massive artillery barrage that seemed to last for hours. The whole world was shaking. Trees were being snapped like twigs, and the air was filled with flying splinters and shrapnel. We were ordered to hold a specific ridge at all costs. At all costs is a phrase officers love to use because they aren't the ones paying the price. We sat there, our engines idling, watching the fog. The Germans came out of that fog like ghosts. They had their Panzers painted white to blend in with the snow. They were moving fast, and they were hitting us with everything they had. We were outnumbered 10-1. I remember the chaos of it. The radio was a mess of screaming voices and static. We'd fire at a shape in the fog, move, and fire again. The Hellcat was at its limit. We were sliding all over the frozen ground, the track struggling to find grip. At one point, we came face to face with a Tiger tank. It was a monster, a massive wall of steel that looked invincible. My heart stopped. I knew our 76mm gun couldn't penetrate his front armor, even at close range. I screamed at Sully to get us around him. We used the only thing we had, our speed. We did a power slide on the ice, the back of the Hellcat swinging around like a race car. We got behind him, and Henderson put 2 rounds into his engine vent before the Tiger's crew even knew we were there. The explosion was so close it rocked us, and the heat from the burning Tiger felt like a gift in that freezing air. We stayed near the wreck for a few minutes, just to soak up the warmth. It's a terrible thing to say, but that's the reality of it. You find comfort wherever you can, even if it's from the funeral pyre of your enemy. By the time the sun went down, the ridge was ours, but at a terrible price. Most of the infantry company we were supporting was gone. The snow wasn't white anymore. It was stained a deep, dark crimson. I walked through the positions later that night, looking for anyone who needed help. I found a young medic sitting by a tree, his hands covered in blood. He wasn't even crying. He was just staring at a pile of discarded bandages. I asked him if he was okay, and he didn't even look at me. He just said, "There's not enough. There's never enough." I didn't know if he meant bandages or time or life itself. I think he meant all of it. I gave him my chocolate bar, the one I'd been saving for Christmas. He took it but didn't eat it. He just held it like it was a holy relic. I never saw him again. I don't know if he made it out of that forest. So many of them didn't. When I think about the bulge, I don't think about the maps or the generals. I think about that medic and the red snow and the way the wind sounded through the frozen pines. It sounded like 1,000 voices whispering all at once, telling us to go home, telling us that we didn't belong there. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. When the spring finally came, it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like the mud was getting warmer. We were moving into Germany now, and the atmosphere changed. In France and Belgium, the people would sometimes come out and cheer, or at least give you a weary wave. In Germany, the windows were shuttered. The streets were empty, except for the white sheets hanging from the houses, the signs of surrender. But you couldn't trust them. We'd roll into a town with white flags flying from every building, and then a sniper would open up from a church steeple, or a kid with a Panzerfaust would jump out from behind a garden wall. That was the most terrifying part of the end of the war, the children. The Germans were so desperate they were putting 12 and 13-year-olds into uniforms that were 3 sizes too big for them. They'd give them a one-shot anti-tank weapon and tell them they were heroes of the fatherland. I remember one incident in a small town near the Rhine. We were moving down a narrow street, the Hellcat's tracks echoing off the stone walls. I saw a movement in a cellar window. It was a boy, maybe 14 at the most. He was aiming a Panzerfaust right at our side. I had my Thompson in my hand. I could have pulled the trigger. I should have pulled the trigger, but I looked at his face. He was terrified. He was shaking so hard the weapon was wobbling. I didn't fire. I just yelled at the top of my lungs, "Drop it now." He looked at me, his eyes wide as saucers, and he just let it fall. He turned and ran into the darkness of the cellar. Henderson looked up at me from the gunner's seat. He didn't say anything, but I could see the relief in his eyes. We didn't want to kill any more kids. We just wanted to go home. We were tired of the killing. We were tired of the noise. We were tired of the smell of the Hellcat. The war ended for us in a small village in Bavaria. We were sitting in a field, the air smelling of clover and damp earth, when the word came over the radio: ceasefire. It wasn't like in the movies. There was no cheering, no tossing of hats into the air. We just sat there. I remember Miller took off his helmet and set it on the ground. He looked at it for a long time, as if he couldn't believe he didn't have to wear it anymore. Sully got out of the driver's seat and just laid down in the grass, looking up at the sky. We didn't talk. What was there to say? We'd survived, but we weren't the same people who had left home 2 years before. We were older in ways that had nothing to do with years. I looked at the Hellcat, our lucky machine. It was covered in dents and scratches. The paint was peeling, and the barrel of the 76mm gun was scorched. It looked as tired as we were. We'd driven that thing across 3 countries through mud and ice and fire. It had been our home and our shield, but in that moment, I hated it. I hated what it represented. I hated that I knew exactly how many seconds it took for a human being to burn to death inside a steel box. I wanted to walk away from it and never look back, but you can't ever really walk away. When I got home, I tried to go back to my old life. I got a job at the local hardware store. I married a girl named Martha who had waited for me the whole time. We had kids and then grandkids. I lived a good life, a quiet life. But the war was always there, just under the surface. I'd be at a 4th of July picnic, and the sound of the fireworks would make me duck for cover before I even realized what I was doing. I'd see a column of smoke from a neighbor's leaf fire, and my mind would immediately calculate the distance and the wind direction. I didn't talk about it for years. Not to Martha, not to my kids. They knew I'd been in the war, but they didn't know about the Hellcat. They didn't know about the 6 tanks or the boy in the cellar. I think I was afraid that if I told them, they'd see the monster I had to become to survive. They'd see the blood on my hands that no amount of soap could ever wash off. But now, at 92, I realized that the story needs to be told. Not to glorify the war. God knows there's no glory in it, but to remember the men. The ones like Miller and Henderson and Sully, and the ones on the other side too. We were all caught in the same storm. We were all just leaves being blown about by a wind we couldn't control. I'm the last one left now. Miller passed away in the 80s. His heart finally gave out. Henderson lived into his 90s, still fixing watches until the day he died. Sully went a few years ago. I miss them. I miss the way we understood each other without having to say a word. There's a bond that forms in a tank destroyer that's different from anything else. You're cramped, you're scared, and you're completely dependent on each other. If one of us had slipped up, we'd all be buried in a field in France. We were a single organism, a 5-headed beast of war. And now, the beast is gone. Only the memories remain. I tell this story because I want people to understand that war isn't a game. It isn't a movie. It's a tragedy that leaves scars on the soul that never heal. I hope no 19-year-old boy ever has to sit in a thin-skinned box and wait for a tiger to turn its turret. I hope no one ever has to know the smell of a brewing up tank. I tell this story for the boys who didn't come back, for the ones whose names are carved in white marble in cemeteries they'll never see. As long as I'm alive, their stories are alive. And maybe if people listen, we won't have to do it all over again. But then, I've seen enough of the world to know that humans have a short memory for pain. We like to dress it up in medals and parades and forget the mud and the blood. Don't forget the mud. Don't forget the red snow. That's the real war. Everything else is just a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the day we finally turned in our M18. It was at a depot in Germany, a vast field filled with hundreds of tanks and trucks and guns. It was a graveyard of machinery. We had to strip out our personal gear, our extra blankets, the little charms we'd tucked into the corners of the turret. I found a small wooden cross that Henderson had carved from a piece of a French fence post. He'd forgotten it. I tucked it into my pocket. I still have it, actually. It sits on my nightstand. It's worn smooth from years of me holding it when I can't sleep. We stood there on the grass, looking at the Hellcat one last time. It looked small and insignificant among the rows of heavy Shermans and Pershings. But to us, it had been the world. A sergeant came by with a clipboard and checked it off. Just a number on a list. He didn't know that this specific machine had killed 6 Panthers in 5 minutes. He didn't know it had carried us through the Ardennes. To him, it was just a pile of scrap metal waiting to be melted down. We walked away, and I felt a strange sense of abandonment. It was like leaving a friend behind in a hospital. We'd spent so much time taking care of that thing, and now it was just gone. We were just men again, no longer tank destroyers, just Henry, Miller, Henderson, and Sully. It was a hard transition. You spend so long being a part of a weapon that you forget how to just be a person. I spent a lot of time in the years after the war just walking. I'd walk through the woods near my house for hours, looking at the trees. I liked the silence. I liked that the only things that moved were the birds and the wind. It took a long time for the noise in my head to quiet down. Sometimes it still flares up. A car backfiring, a sudden shout, the smell of grease at a mechanic's shop, it all brings it back. But I've learned to live with it. It's like an old injury that aches when the weather changes. You don't get over it, you just get used to it. I look at my great-grandchildren now, playing on the floor with their plastic blocks, and I see the innocence I lost at 19. I see the world they live in, and I hope they never have to know how fragile it really is. We think the world is solid, but it's not. It's held together by the thin thread of our choices. One wrong decision, one moment of madness, and it all comes crashing down. That's what I learned in the Hellcat. We were the ones holding the line, the ones making the split-second choices that decided who lived and who died. It's a burden no one should have to carry. The doctors tell me my heart is getting tired. I'm 92, so I suppose that's to be expected. I'm not afraid. I've faced death before, in a muddy field in France and a frozen forest in Belgium. Death isn't the enemy. The enemy is forgetting. The enemy is losing the truth of what happened in the noise of history. That's why I'm talking now. That's why I'm sharing these pieces of my soul. I want you to feel the vibration of the engine. I want you to smell the cordite. I want you to see the faces of the boys in those burning tanks. Because if we don't remember the cost, we'll be tempted to pay it again. And believe me, the price is always higher than you think. I'm going to rest now. My eyes are getting heavy and the sun is starting to set. It's a beautiful evening. No smoke in the air, no sound of artillery, just the quiet of a world at peace. I think I'll sit here for a while and just enjoy the silence. It's a silence we fought for, a silence we paid for in full. I hope you value it as much as I do. I want to tell you about one more thing, something I haven't even told my children. A few months after the war ended, while we were still in the occupation force, I went back to that road where we hit those 6 tanks. I don't know why I did it. Some part of me needed to see it again, to see it without the smoke and the terror. The tanks were still there mostly. They'd been pushed into the ditches to clear the road. They were rusted already, their camouflage fading under the sun and rain. Local kids were playing on them. I saw a little girl sitting on the turret of the Panther we'd hit first. She was singing a song, swinging her legs against the steel that had once been a furnace. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Life was coming back. The machine was dead, but the child was alive. That was the moment I realized that we'd won. Not because we'd killed the Panzers, but because we'd made it safe for a little girl to sing on their graves. That's the only victory that matters. Everything else is just geography and politics. Remember the girl on the tank. Remember the silence of the woods. And remember the boys who didn't get to come home to their own gardens. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I think about the concept of home a lot. When we were over there, home was a mystical place, a paradise of white picket fences and Sunday dinners. We'd talk about it like it was a dream. But when you get back, you realize home isn't the same. You've changed. And because you've changed, the place feels different. The people are the same. The buildings are the same. But the connection is frayed. I remember sitting at the dinner table with my parents my first night back. My mother had made a pot roast, my favorite. She was talking about the neighbors and the local gossip, and I was sitting there staring at the roast. I couldn't stop thinking about how much it looked like. Well, I couldn't eat it. I had to excuse myself and go outside. I sat on the porch and watched the lightning bugs. My father came out a few minutes later and sat next to me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me to buck up. He just pulled out a pack of cigarettes, gave me one, and we sat there in the dark. He'd been in the First War, in the trenches. He knew. He knew that there was a part of me that would never really leave Europe. He knew that the boy who'd left had died in a Hellcat, and the man who'd come back was a stranger. That was the greatest gift he ever gave me, that silence. He didn't try to bridge the gap. He just sat with me on the edge of it. I wonder sometimes if the world today understands that. We're so quick to judge, so quick to pick sides and yell at each other. We treat everything like a battle, but a real battle doesn't have winners. It only has survivors. I wish I could take every person who wants to start a fight and put them in that M18 for just 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes of the noise, the fear, and the smell of death. I think they'd come out a lot quieter. I think they'd look at their neighbors a little differently. We're all we've got. This world is a small place, and we're all riding in a thin-skinned box through the dark. We can either take care of each other, or we can burn. I chose to try and take care of people. I spent my life trying to build things, to fix things, to be a good neighbor. It was my way of balancing the scales. For every life I took, I tried to add something good back into the world. I don't know if I succeeded. Only God can judge that, but I tried. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. We try to be better than the worst thing we've ever done. My hands are shaking again. It's not the cold this time, just the age. I think I've said enough. The sun is almost gone now, and the shadows are long across the yard. It's time for me to go inside. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share these ghosts with you. It makes them feel a little less heavy. I hope you have a peaceful night. I hope you wake up in a world that's a little kinder than the one I saw in 1944. Good night. It's funny how the mind works when you get to be my age. You can't remember where you put your glasses 5 minutes ago, but you can remember the exact shade of red of the dust at Camp Hood, Texas, in the summer of 1943. That's where the journey really began for me. I was just a skinny kid from a town where the biggest news of the week was usually the price of corn or who got caught behind the Grange Hall with whose daughter. Then Uncle Sam sends a letter, and suddenly I'm standing in the middle of a Texas wasteland, sweating through a wool uniform and learning how to kill men I'd never met. They told us we were the elite. They told us the tank destroyer force was the answer to the German blitzkrieg. We had this patch on our shoulders, a black panther crushing a tank in its jaws. We felt like giants. But looking back, we were just children playing with the most dangerous toys ever built. The training was brutal. They marched us until our feet were nothing but blisters, and then they made us march some more. But the real change happened when they introduced us to the M18. Up until then, we'd been using these M10s, which were okay, but they were slow. Then the Hellcat arrived. I remember the first time I saw one. It didn't look like a tank. It looked like a predatory insect. It sat low to the ground, and it had these thin, graceful lines. A guy from the Buick factory, yeah, the car company made them, came out to talk to us. He stood there with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and told us that this machine could hit 55 miles per hour on a paved road. In 1943, that was like saying it could fly. We didn't believe him until we saw Sully get behind the wheel. He took that thing out on the range and opened it up, and the roar of that radial engine was something I'll never forget. It sounded like a thunderstorm trapped in a tin can. We spent months learning that machine. We learned how to change a track in the dark, how to bore sight the 76mm gun until we could hit a barrel at 1,000 yards, and how to live in a space no bigger than a walk-in closet. My crew? We became a family before we ever saw a drop of salt water. Miller was the youngest, always talking about his girl back in West Virginia. Henderson was the older one, the steady hand. Sully was a grease monkey from Detroit who could make an engine purr just by talking to it. And me? I was the one who had to make the decisions. I was the one who had to look through the periscope and decide if we were going to live or die that day. It's a lot of weight for a 19-year-old. You don't feel it at the time, not really. You're too busy trying to remember your manual settings and hoping you don't screw up in front of the sergeant. The weight comes later. It comes when you're 92 and the house is quiet. I remember the trip across the Atlantic. They packed us into a troop ship like sardines. The smell was a mix of diesel, vomit, and fear. Thousands of men, all headed toward a horizon that promised nothing but chaos. I spent most of my time on the deck, staring at the gray water and wondering if there was a U-boat out there looking at us through a periscope. You feel so small on the ocean. You realize that the whole war, as big as it seems, is just a tiny speck on the face of the earth. We landed in Scotland and then moved down to England, waiting for our turn. We missed the initial D-Day landings by a few weeks. By the time we rolled our Hellcats onto the soil of Utah Beach, the initial carnage had been cleared away, but the smell of it remained. It was a sweet, sickly smell that hung over the dunes. It was the smell of the end of innocence. Moving through the French hedgerows, the bocage, was a nightmare. Those hedges were hundreds of years old, thick as stone walls and taller than a man. You couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. Every turn was an ambush waiting to happen. The Germans would hide their anti-tank guns in the roots of the hedges, and you wouldn't know they were there until the guy in front of you turned into a pillar of fire. The Hellcat wasn't built for that kind of fighting. We were built for the open plains, for speed. In the hedgerows, our speed meant nothing. We were just thin-skinned targets. I remember the first time we took a hit. It wasn't a killing blow, just a piece of shrapnel that clattered off the turret, but it sounded like a hammer hitting a bell. Inside, we all froze. For a second, nobody breathed. We realized then that the steel between us and the world was only half an inch thick in some places. You could punch a hole through it with a heavy machine gun if you were close enough. That's when the bravado from Camp Hood vanished. We weren't panthers anymore. We were mice in a field full of cats. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The first man I saw die wasn't even a soldier. He was a French farmer who had come out to wave at us as we rolled through a small village near St. Lo. He was standing near a stone well, smiling, holding up a bottle of something, cider probably. Then a mortar round came in. It didn't make a whistle, just a soft thwack in the air. The man just disappeared in a cloud of gray dust and red mist. When the dust settled, the well was gone, the man was gone, and the bottle was lying in the dirt, unbroken. I stared at that bottle as we drove past. I couldn't understand how a man could be wiped off the earth while a piece of glass survived. It didn't seem fair. It didn't make any sense. I looked at Sully, and he was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering levers. None of us said a word. We just kept moving. That was the rule. Keep moving. If you stop to mourn, you become the next target. We had our first real tank-on-tank engagement a week later. We were patrolling a ridge when we spotted a Mark IV Panzer sitting in the middle of a field. He was hull down, which means only his turret was showing. He saw us at the same time we saw him. I yelled for Henderson to fire, but the German was faster. His shell hit the ground right in front of us, showering the turret with dirt. I thought we were dead. I really did. I remember thinking, so this is it. This is how it ends. But Sully didn't panic. He slammed the Hellcat into reverse, zigzagging through the mud while Henderson tracked the target. We ducked behind a small copse of trees, and I could hear the German shells screaming overhead. They have this particular sound, like a freight train passing an inch from your ear. I told Sully to floor it. We used that Buick engine for everything it was worth. We circled around the back of the ridge, pushing the machine through brush that would have stopped a Jeep. We came out 300 yards to the German's left. He was still looking at the trees where we'd been. Henderson didn't miss. He put a 76mm round right into the side of the Panzer's turret. The whole thing just erupted. It wasn't like the movies where there's a big clean explosion. It was a messy, violent thing. The turret flew off, and this thick, oily smoke started pouring out. We didn't stay to celebrate. We moved. That was the lesson we learned early on. Hit and run. If you stand still, you're a ghost. The heat inside the Hellcat during those summer months was something else. Because it was an open-top turret, you'd think it would be cool, but it wasn't. The sun beat down on the steel, and the engine sat right behind us, radiating heat like a furnace. We were constantly covered in a layer of sweat and grit. Our uniforms turned a strange shade of gray-brown. We stopped shaving. We stopped caring about anything except the next meal and the next mile. You start to lose your humanity in small increments. You forget what it's like to sleep in a bed or eat off a plate. You become part of the machine. I started thinking in terms of fuel levels and ammunition counts. I didn't think about the war in terms of freedom or democracy. I thought about it in terms of whether we had enough AP rounds to get through the afternoon. I remember a night in Normandy when the rain was coming down so hard we couldn't see the end of the gun barrel. We were parked under a line of poplar trees, trying to get some sleep. Miller was trying to light a cigarette under a poncho, swearing softly. Suddenly, we heard footsteps. Not the heavy thud of boots, but something lighter. I grabbed my Thompson and leaned over the side. It was a dog, a little terrier, soaked to the bone and shivering. He looked up at me with these pathetic eyes. I reached down and lifted him into the turret. He spent the night curled up against Miller's chest. For those few hours, we weren't killers. We were just four guys taking care of a dog. In the morning, when we had to move out, the dog jumped out and ran toward a nearby farmhouse. I often wonder if he made it. I hope he did. I hope he found a warm hearth and someone to give him a bone. It's strange the things you hold on to. I can't tell you the names of the officers in my battalion, but I remember the way that dog's fur felt under my hand. The fear is always there, you know. It's like a low-frequency hum in the back of your mind. You try to ignore it. You try to drown it out with talk or work, but it never really goes away. It peaks when you hear the distant rumble of artillery or when the scouts come back with reports of Tiger tanks in the area. The Tiger, that was the boogeyman. We were told our guns could handle them, but we knew better. We'd seen the wrecks of Shermans that had been ripped open like sardine cans by the Tiger's 88. When you're in a Hellcat, you know that one hit from an 88 is the end of the story. There are no minor hits from a Tiger. You just cease to exist. So you live with that knowledge. You learn to sleep with one eye open and one hand on your holster. You learn to value the moments of quiet because you know they're just the transition between one horror and the next. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. We moved toward Paris in August. The liberation was a whirlwind. People were throwing flowers, handing us bottles of wine, kissing our dirty faces. It was surreal. One day you're killing people in a ditch, and the next you're being treated like a god. I remember a woman in a blue dress who ran up to our tank and handed me a loaf of bread. She was crying, and she kept saying merci over and over. I didn't know how to react. I just took the bread and nodded. I felt like an imposter. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't a hero, that I was just a scared kid who happened to have a big gun. But you can't say that. You have to be the hero they need you to be. You play the part. You smile for the cameras. and then you move back into the darkness. After Paris, the war got grim again. The Germans were retreating, but they were doing it stubbornly. They left traps everywhere. They'd blow the bridges, mine the roads, and leave small suicide squads behind to slow us down. This was when we started seeing the real devastation of the French countryside. Villages that had stood for centuries were nothing but scorched earth. I remember driving through a town where the only thing left standing was a single chimney. A black cat was sitting on top of the rubble, cleaning its paws as if nothing had happened. It was the most haunting thing I'd ever seen. Nature doesn't care about our wars. The grass grows over the trenches, the cats sit on the ruins, and the sun keeps rising. Only humans carry the damage. We were nearing the German border when we hit a stretch of road that became known as the Haunted Woods. It was a dense forest, the trees so thick they blocked out the sun even at noon. The air was cold and damp, and there was a silence there that felt heavy, like it was pressing against your ears. We were moving in a column, 5 Hellcats and a platoon of infantry. Suddenly the world exploded. A mine went off under the lead tank, flipping it onto its side. Then the machine guns started. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere. We couldn't see the enemy, but we could see the tracers. The infantry were diving for cover, screaming for help. I saw a young sergeant get hit in the shoulder, spinning around like a top before falling into the mud. I told Henderson to fire at the muzzle flashes. We went through 3 boxes of machine gun ammo in 10 minutes. I was standing in the turret, firing my Thompson, not even aiming, just trying to keep their heads down. The noise was deafening. You can't hear yourself think in a firefight, you just act. It's all muscle memory and instinct. Sully managed to push our Hellcat forward, using the burning lead tank as a shield. We found a machine gun nest tucked into a hollow log, and Henderson took it out with a high explosive shell. After about 20 minutes, it was over. The Germans had slipped away into the woods. We were left with 3 dead infantrymen and a wrecked tank. I got out of the turret and walked over to the dead boys. They looked so small. They looked like they were just sleeping, except for the way their eyes were open, staring at nothing. I took their dog tags. That was my job. I had a pocket full of dog tags by the end of the war. Every one of them was a life, a family, a future that ended in the mud of Europe. You think you get used to it, but you don't. You just get better at hiding the shock. You learn to put on a mask of indifference. If you let yourself feel every death, you'll go crazy. So you become cold. You become hard. I remember looking at my hands that night and seeing they were covered in carbon and grease. I tried to wash them, but the dirt wouldn't come off. It felt like it was part of my skin. I think that was when I realized I would never be clean again. Not really. The war gets inside you. It lives in your pores. It stays with you even when you put on a clean shirt and go to church 40 years later. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. By September, the supply lines were stretched thin. We were running out of everything: fuel, ammo, even food. We spent 3 days sitting in a field, waiting for a fuel truck that never came. We had to siphon gas out of wrecked trucks just to keep our heaters going at night. The nights were getting colder. You could feel the winter coming, and everyone was nervous. We knew the Germans weren't done yet. They were like a wounded animal, more dangerous because they were cornered. I spent those days cleaning the gun. It was the only thing I could control. I'd take the breech block apart and oil every piece until it shone. Miller would sit nearby, writing letters to his girl. He'd read them out loud sometimes. They were full of talk about the future, about the house they'd build and the kids they'd have. I'd listen and pretend I was back home too. It was a way to escape for a few minutes. I remember one afternoon, a group of German prisoners was marched past us. They were a pathetic sight. Most of them were either old men or boys who looked like they should be in middle school. They were shivering, their uniforms in rags. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 15, stopped and looked at our Hellcat. He looked at the 76mm gun and then at me. There was no hatred in his eyes, just a profound, crushing exhaustion. I reached into my pocket and found a piece of hard candy. I threw it to him. He caught it, nodded once, and kept walking. My sergeant saw me do it and chewed me out for coddling the enemy. I didn't care. At that moment, that kid wasn't the enemy. He was just a cold, hungry boy. If things had been different, maybe we would have been friends. Maybe we would have played baseball or gone fishing. But the world had other plans for us. We were meant to kill each other for reasons we barely understood. As we pushed toward the Siegfried Line, the German defenses became much more formidable. These weren't just dirt trenches anymore. They were concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth tank obstacles, and massive artillery emplacements. It was a wall of steel and stone. We spent weeks trying to find a way through. Every time we moved, the 88s would start barking. Those guns, they haunt my dreams more than anything else. The sound of an 88 firing is like a whip cracking across the sky. You don't have time to react. If you see the flash, you're usually already dead. I saw a Hellcat from C Company get hit by an 88 from 2,000 yards away. It hit the front sprocket and the whole tank just disintegrated. There were no survivors. There wasn't even enough left to bury. We had to be smart. We started using the Hellcat speed to do reconnaissance by fire. We'd sprint across an open field, draw the German fire, and then duck back into cover while our artillery spotted the German positions. It was the most terrifying job in the world. You're literally bait. You're driving as fast as you can, praying that the German gunner is having a bad day. I remember my heart racing every time Sully shifted into fourth gear. The wind would whip through the open turret, and I'd be crouching as low as I could, watching for that telltale puff of smoke from the tree line. It's a miracle we survived those weeks. I don't believe in fate, but I do believe in luck, and we had more than our share. One evening, we were parked in the ruins of a small barn. The roof was gone, but the walls were still standing, giving us some concealment. I was sharing a tin of cold sea rations with Henderson. It was some kind of meat and beans that tasted like wet cardboard. We were talking about what we'd do when we got home. Henderson wanted to buy a boat and just spend a year on the water, far away from any noise. I told him I just wanted to sleep for a week. Suddenly, we heard a low, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't artillery, it was music. Somewhere, in a German bunker not far away, someone was playing a gramophone. It was a classical piece, something soft and beautiful. It floated over the ruins like a ghost. We sat there in the dark, listening to the enemy's music. It was a reminder that even in the middle of all this madness, there was still a desire for something beautiful. It made the war feel even more absurd. Two groups of men, both sitting in the dark, both listening to the same music, both waiting for the sun to rise so they could try to kill each other again. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The winter of '44 really started to bite in November. The rain turned to sleet, and the mud froze into jagged ruts that tore at our tracks. We were constantly cold. No matter how many blankets you had, the dampness found a way in. We started getting trench foot, a condition where your feet literally start to rot because they're always wet. I remember spending every spare second rubbing my feet with grease, trying to keep the moisture out. It's hard to stay focused on the enemy when you're worried about whether your toes are going to fall off. But you keep going. You don't have a choice. The army is a machine, and you're just a gear. If the gear stops turning, the machine breaks. We were part of a big push to capture a bridgehead across the Roer River. The Germans had flooded the area, turning the fields into a swamp. We were confined to the roads, which made us easy targets. I remember one morning when the fog was so thick you couldn't see the tank 5 yards ahead of you. We were moving at a crawl. Suddenly, a German soldier stepped out of the fog right in front of our Hellcat. He was holding a Panzerfaust. He was so close I could see the stubble on his chin. He looked at me and I looked at him. For a split second, time stopped. He didn't fire. He just looked at me with this expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He dropped the weapon and ran back into the fog. I didn't shoot him. I couldn't. I just sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs. I often wonder why he didn't pull the trigger. Maybe he was just as tired of it all as I was. Maybe he just wanted to go home too. That fog was our best friend and our worst enemy. It hid us from the German gunners, but it also meant we could stumble into a trap at any moment. We spent those days in a state of constant vibrating tension. Every sound was a threat. Every shadow was a sniper. You stop being a person and start being a sensory organ. Your hearing becomes superhuman. You can hear the click of a safety being moved 50 yards away. Your eyes scan the horizon with a mechanical precision. It's exhausting. It drains the life out of you. By the time the sun went down, I'd be so tired I couldn't even speak. I'd just roll into my blanket and collapse. I think about the families of the men we fought. I think about the German mothers who waited for letters that never came. I think about the wives who had to raise children alone. We were taught to hate them, to see them as monsters. But they were just people. They were caught in the same current we were. The politicians and the generals make the decisions, and the boys in the mud pay the price. It's a story as old as time, but you don't realize it until you're the one in the mud. I look at the world now, and I see the same patterns repeating. It breaks my heart. We never learn. We just find new ways to kill each other. I'm 92 now, and the world is a very different place. People talk about the good war, but there's no such thing. There's only war, and it's always bad. It's always a waste. I'm proud that I served my country. I'm proud that we stopped the darkness that was spreading across Europe. But I'm not proud of the killing. I'm not proud of the fact that I can still hear the screams of men burning in their tanks. Those memories are the price I pay for my survival. I've carried them for 80 years, and I'll carry them to my grave. I hope that by telling this story, I can lighten the load just a little bit. I hope that someone, somewhere, will listen and understand that peace is the most precious thing we have. It's worth more than any medal or any territory. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten.